It was a good day. It was the perfect day for a long run on the beach, a hot shower, and then soccer on TV. San Diego State was on in the morning and USC was on in the afternoon. I put on my sneakers, walked out the back door of my house, and turned south. After reaching the 5-mile marker, I turned back toward home. The run cleared the cobwebs from my mind, and by mile 8 I had completely forgotten about the last work week. La Jolla was beautiful this time of year. Half the country is covered in snow and I'm running on the beach in shorts. After a quick shower, I put on pants, a polo shirt, and a pair of topsiders and headed to Tequila Joe's. By the time I got to Tequila Joe's, San Diego State was already one touchdown ahead. I loved the place. There were 4 big TVs with different games on each, good food, and the waitresses were friendly, and not too pushy. Margot was my favorite. Cute, compact, and she always had a smile for this old guy. She was too young, and I had no intentions with her. But just a warm smile made my weekend better. I spent many Saturdays here watching soccer, and a few Sundays too. The San Diego State team controlled the game, moved the ball well, and scored. The defense was holding up as well. My chicken salad lunch was a thing of the past, and I had just ordered a second beer. The San Diego State team was running another score when he walked in. I didn't see him, but he saw me. He headed straight for my table. As he approached my table, I was surprised to notice him. Then he spoke words I hoped I would never hear again. "Hello, Father." Those words shocked me. It had once been such a joy to hear those words, but those times were long gone. Now those words just cut. I looked at the boy. Damn it, he wasn't a boy anymore. He was over 21 now. It had been 5 long years since I'd last seen him. When I'd left, Robert had been 16 years old and had just started shaving. He had matured a little. He had gotten older and put on muscle. He was a young man now. I said, "Hello, Robert." "Tell me why," he hissed. Hundreds of times, looking at hundreds of sunsets, I remembered what I would say if this encounter ever happened, but now I couldn't remember the words. I looked at Robert. There was anger in his eyes. He stood with his fists clenched and his knuckles were white. I realized that if I stood up, he would probably knock me down, so I stayed seated. I felt genuinely sorry for the boy. I didn't want to hurt him. Hell, I'd hurt him enough as it was. He and his brothers must have had a rough time in the last half-decade. I said the only thing I could think of, the truth. "I'm not your father." "What?" he asked. "I suppose you're asking why I abandoned you, your brothers, and your mother 5 years ago. The reason is that I am not your father." This stunned him, confused him, and he unclenched his fists. Confusion was reflected on his face, and I could tell that statement rocked his world. The missing pieces were falling into place. I stood up and guided him to a chair. Looking at him, I could see that his world was crumbling, just like mine had 5 years ago. I called Margot over and ordered a couple of beers. Once upon a time, I had fantasized about doing just that, sharing a beer with my son, but it wasn't what I'd envisioned. "How? What?" was all he could say. I looked him in the eye and started. "I'll start at the beginning. Your mom and I met on the first day of school. It was second period science class. She had just moved to Denver from Oklahoma and was new to the school. She was the last one to enter the lab, and the only seat available was next to me. No one wanted to sit next to me because I had a reputation for being one of the smart kids. The kids never socialized with the smart kids and didn't want to sit next to them. Sandy, as a new girl, ended up sitting next to me. I couldn't have been happier. She was the most beautiful girl I had ever seen. She was tall and blonde. Those were 2 of my favorite features. She was slender. She looked at me and smiled, which melted my heart. From that moment on, I was hooked on her. Science class was hard and Mr. Rothenberg was a strict honor student. Sandy was smart, but math and science were not her best subjects. Since we were lab partners, I tutored with her and had to help her in this class. Twice a week we studied at the library. For some unknown reason, she took a liking to me. We got along great and quickly became inseparable. She got a solid B on her exam. We became best friends that year. In sophomore year, we had 3 classes together. I helped her with math and she helped me with my essay. The rest of high school, we were a couple. We went to all the soccer games, dances, and parties together. My senior year of high school, we had a crisis. I was accepted to MIT in Boston. We didn't want to be separated, so we worked hard and got her accepted to Boston College. We graduated and spent a wonderful summer together. In the fall, we packed up and moved to Boston together. We rented a small apartment near her school, and I commuted to classes in Cambridge. I received a scholarship for my tuition, and for Sandy, we took out a school loan. Our parents helped us with rent and food. We were young, in love, and happy. My school was hard. I had to study every night and many weekends. A lot was demanded of me, and I wanted to be top of my class. Sandy didn't have that kind of workload or commitment. She wanted to get her degree, be with me, and have fun. We were in love. This is where your mother's social position developed. Sandy developed a close group of friends, both female and male. I didn't pay much attention to that at the time. She liked having friends around and being the center of their attention. She was always very friendly with everyone. So, we spent every summer at home and then went east in the fall. 4 years flew by. I earned a degree in aeronautical engineering and Sandy earned a bachelor's degree in history. We came home to Denver and my parents threw us a great homecoming party. All of our friends were there. It was there that I got down on my knees and proposed to your mom. Everyone already knew we were getting married, but it was an official event. She cried and quickly said yes. After the party, we partied all night. I avoided the details. No boy wants to hear the frank details of his mother's life. Before graduation, I sent out several job applications and talked to several companies at job fairs. Now that I had my degree, I decided to get a real job. I interviewed at a few places and they said they wanted me. But to do that, we would have to move. Sandy and I wanted to stay in Denver. She wanted to stay close to friends and family. I got an offer from Telluride Technologies in their airplane design department and accepted. I started at the bottom, but quickly settled in and was promoted to team leader. They had a contract with Boeing, and we did some of their design work. We worked on cutting-edge stuff, and my MIT education helped a lot. Sandy worked for an insurance company doing medical billing. It wasn't a difficult job for her, but she didn't mind. She was planning a wedding and was very busy. She was busy with her friends and coworkers. The months flew by, and the next thing you know, we were standing at the altar. We were married in a beautiful ceremony in the backyard of your grandmother's house. All of our families, your grandparents, and all of our coworkers were there. It was a wonderful day. I still have memories of that day. You've seen the pictures? I thought she was the best thing that ever happened to me. For an MIT grad, I was clueless. We rented a small apartment and set up house. Robert absorbed it all. I'm sure he had heard these stories before, but now he was listening intently, trying to find the pieces that were missing from his personal puzzle. I continued. At work, I started to get noticed. One day I was called into my supervisor's office and asked if I wanted to move to a new division. There were several other people with us. I thought it was strange that my boss didn't introduce us to each other. I found out later that they were from the government, very high up in the Air Force. I asked a couple questions about what we would be working on, but he just brushed them off. He didn't give me any idea what the future would be like, but he said I'd love it and that I'd get a pay raise. I agreed. I filled out a bunch of forms from these two guys. When I got home, I told Sandy that I had just been promoted, and we celebrated. The following Monday, I showed up for work and was given a report on a project called Have Blue. I was supposed to start working on new technology for the Air Force. Technically, we said we were working on reducing the cross-section of radar signatures while increasing combat capabilities. Today, we call that work stealth. It was very secret work. It was fun, but it took a toll on Sandy and me. Sandy supported me, and we made love every chance we got. She never turned me down. But sometimes I had to work late, and she had to entertain herself on her own. She had a group of friends from work and would stop by on her way home from work to have a couple drinks. I wasn't worried. I knew most of her coworkers, and for the most part, they weren't bad people. When I got home, she was already waiting for me. In retrospect, I think I should have been more considerate. 3 months after I started, Sandy called me at work and told me she was pregnant. I was ecstatic. I was going to be a father. I called my mom, my sister, and everyone else I could think of. I came home right away and we celebrated again. We stayed up late into the night and planned everything down to college for our baby. Over the next few months, we painted the nursery room and prepared for the arrival of our family. A few months later, you came along. I was in the delivery room and watched you come into the world. I think it was the happiest day of my life. You were gorgeous. 2 arms, 2 legs, a beautiful face, and a loud cry. Robert just listened. I looked over and caught Margot's gaze. She was right next to me. Was she listening? Did it matter? She brought out 2 more mugs of beer. We were discussing names. I have to say, I debated names. I wanted to name you after my father, Edward, or my grandfather, Peter. But Sandy wouldn't listen to anything. She named you Robert, and that was the end of it. I was just happy to have a son, and I didn't really care. So I named you Robert. With a new mouth to feed, I felt I had to work even harder. I wanted to provide for you and our family. I still made time for Sandy, but she was always tired. I helped change diapers and fed her after midnight, but things were stressful. Sandy stayed home for a couple more months, but I felt it was tiring her out. She needed adult company, and I advised her to go back to work. My mom could babysit. Sandy was much happier after that. Sandy worked hard to get back into shape. After you were born, she walked almost every day and did aerobics. After 6 weeks, she looked great. Soon we got into a routine: work, feeding, and sleeping. Sandy was even able to go out with her coworkers a few evenings while I stayed home. Not 6 months later, Sandy informed me that she was pregnant again. We quickly decided that our little apartment was too cramped and started looking for a house. We saved up money for a down payment and soon found an apartment in the suburbs. It was a beautiful house with a big yard. We moved in, and a month later we were back in the maternity ward. Your brother arrived screaming and kicking. I wanted to name him Edward or Peter again, but your mom named him Randy. I relented, and Randy came into our family. I thought we were happy. I didn't have the slightest idea that anything was wrong. With 2 boys in diapers, I thought stress was normal. After Randy was born, we decided Sandy couldn't go back to work. She kept in touch with all her work friends and occasionally got out to see her girlfriends. A year later, Sandy got pregnant again. 9 months later, Tim came along. Another year later, Michael came along. You were 4 years old when Michael was born. After Michael, we decided 4 boys were enough and Sandy had her tubes tied. But I was happy. We quickly discovered that our house was too small. We shopped around and found a house in Aurora. It was a great house with a yard big enough for all you kids and your toys. I began to notice something special about Sandy. For one thing, she never once called you our boys. She always said her boys. I attributed it to maternal pride, but it still bothered me. Another thing she did was discount my work and me. Whenever we went to one of her social events, she would say that I painted airplanes for a living. I didn't correct her because I didn't want to embarrass her in front of her friends, and also because my work was secret and I couldn't discuss it anyway. But it still hurt. My job was very stressful. I was now leading the development team for a new stealth fighter. There was discontent in the Middle East, and the Air Force was putting a lot of pressure. I and my team were getting results. My bosses were pleased and showed it by putting more work on my plate. But even with all that work, I still made it to all the minor league games. I coached a couple of your teams and cheered every hit. That in itself was a challenge. With the 4 of you, I had a hard time with that. When Michael started school, Sandy had a lot of free time. My job was paying a good salary, so she didn't need to work. So she did something else. She became a volunteer. She worked with the Breast Cancer Society and the Library Foundation. She found a way to fill almost every spare minute. She worked hard and was very successful, and she made a whole new group of friends. All in all, life was good. My stealth fighter flew and wowed the world during the Gulf War. You grew up and we played sports. Sandy was involved in the community and seemed happy. Our life together was quite satisfactory. However, I began to feel that she resented my relationship with you boys. I realize now that sometimes she tried to drive a wedge between us. I can see that she was trying to complicate our lives. Sandy signed you up for baseball and Randy signed you up for soccer. She enrolled Tim in volleyball and Michael in music school. I never understood why each of you had to have your own sport. And Michael was in music. He was good. I don't have a single musical bone in my body, and I didn't think Sandy did either. But Michael was a really gifted musician. I don't know where he got that from. I used to joke with Sandy that the mailman must be a great musician, and she just smiled. And then it all came crashing down. I had just turned 40 and the Air Force asked me to get a physical. I hadn't seen a doctor in years. I was healthy as a horse. The physical was very comprehensive. I had a treadmill test, blood work, and even a finger test. Everything was going well until the doctor checked my testicles. He found something. He wasn't sure what it was and didn't tell me anything. He called a specialist. They set up an appointment for me the next day. When the medical community works so fast and gets you an appointment with a specialist the next day, you start to worry. I didn't say anything at home and had a very restless night. The next day, the specialist ran a bunch of tests, scans, more blood tests. By the end of the exam, he seemed a little more relaxed. He told me to get dressed and then discuss the test results with me. We sat in his office and he explained that they thought I had a tumor, but it turned out to be some scar tissue. He asked if I had any serious injuries, and all I could remember was a motorcycle accident I had gotten into when I was 14. I was riding my motorcycle on a dirt road when I fell and the bike went up. I spent a couple days in the hospital but recovered quickly. And then it shattered my world. He said, "It made you infertile." "I'm not infertile. I have 4 sons." "Well, I don't know anything about that, but the tests show that you are infertile." I got angry and ran out of there. The next day, I got a second opinion. He said the same thing. I was infertile. The next day, I got a third opinion. Same thing. On the 4th day, I went to another one for proof. I took all 4 of you to the doctor. I told you and Sandy that we were getting flu shots, but we were actually taking DNA tests. I looked at Robert. I asked if he remembered that day. He nodded affirmatively. There were tears in his eyes. 2 weeks later, I got the results. I didn't think it could get any worse, but it turned out to be even worse. Not only were the 4 of you not mine, but each of you had a different father. I was devastated. I went to the nearest bar and sat down. I pondered the meaning of it all. I had questions, but no answers. I tried to remember any clue, but I couldn't find any. My entire married life was a lie. Who was I married to? When? How? Where? After 3 double shots of single malt scotch, I called a cab and went home. The next day, I got up early, hungover, and drove to work. I couldn't think, I couldn't concentrate, and I couldn't even talk. My team noticed this and sent me home early. Sandy made dinner that night. I remember it like it was yesterday. All you boys were at a high school basketball game. She put on a blue dress and made spaghetti. We drank Chianti. I sat across from Sandy. I looked at her and wondered. I couldn't bring myself to ask. I looked at her with new eyes. I looked closer, and I didn't like what I saw. I saw evil. I saw ugliness. I felt sick. She asked me what was wrong. I couldn't answer. I ran to the bathroom and threw up. I threw up from dinner. I threw up lunch. I threw up my past, everything. I threw up until there was nothing left. Then I threw up blood. In that toilet, I saw my life and my future. Sandy asked if she should call a doctor. I replied, "No, just leave me alone." She was concerned. Now? Now she was concerned? I threw up again. Sandy took me to the spare bed and laid me down. I cried all night. When I got up, it was still dark. I didn't know what I was going to do. I just knew I couldn't go on like this. I went to Denny's, drank some juice and ate a couple eggs. I managed to hold it together. I went to the park and watched the sunrise. It was a beautiful sunrise. The sky is red in the morning, sailor's warning. I went to the office and resigned. They tried to talk me out of it. They asked me what was the matter. I didn't say anything. I just resigned. I went to the bank and withdrew half of my 401k, almost $80,000. I went home. No one was there. I looked for everything I needed, but I didn't see anything. There was nothing here for me. I wrote a note and left it on the table. All it said was, "I know." I got in my truck and drove away, leaving my house, your house, for the last time. I pulled onto the freeway and wondered where I was going. I looked up into the clear blue sky and saw a hawk. It was flying east and I turned east. I don't remember thinking about you boys, or even Sandy. All I wanted to do was run away from the pain. I remember very little about those first few days. I didn't stop until I hit the Atlantic Ocean somewhere in Maine. I don't remember much about the trip east. I think I threw all my credit cards in the river and paid for everything in cash. My first memory of that trip was when I got to the ocean. I looked at Robert and continued. When I got to the ocean, I just sat and looked out over its expanse. To this day, all I have in my memory is the memory of looking out at the ocean and wondering how far I could swim before I gave up. How soon the waves would pick me up and erase the pain. I thought about jumping into the water and swimming until I drowned. More than once, I stripped off my clothes, folded them neatly on the shore, and walked into the waves, only to realize later that I couldn't do it. The darkness consumed me, but in the end, I didn't even have the strength to kill myself. I continued on my way, sleeping in a truck and only getting a hotel room when I needed a shower. I stayed near the coast and fought with myself every day, thinking about the last swim. How easy, painless, and final it would be. Unfortunately, I had a friend who committed suicide, and I remembered the pain and questions he left behind. And even with all my hardships, I couldn't do that to you and your brothers. I was a bum and a homeless vagrant. I turned south and traveled up the East Coast. I wanted to save my money, so I got a job. I worked as a dishwasher in a restaurant in Annapolis. I stayed there for a while, and then I moved on. A couple weeks here, a month there. I worked as a cook, a waiter, and even drove a streetcar at Disney World for a couple months. I was working at a machine shop in Atlanta when the FBI found me. Apparently, the feds don't like it when people with top-secret clearances disappear. I was working at a place called Al's Brakes. Al was a big guy, very typical of a mechanic. He was always wearing a greasy shirt with Al written on the pocket, and he always had an unlit cigar in the corner of his mouth. After working there for about 2 weeks, I got to work one morning and Al met me at the door. He said a couple guys wanted to talk to me and escorted me into his office. There were 2 agents waiting for me there. When I saw them, the fear and pain came back. I thought they were going to take me back. I wondered if I should leave, but before I could turn around, one of the agents spoke. "We've been looking for you for a long time and we hate to do it again. Please have a seat." I realized they had guns and sat down. They never gave me their names. Then, in typical government fashion, they began to interrogate me. It would have been better to say, interrogate. I had dealt with the feds and security many times before, and they no longer intimidated me as much as they used to. They asked what happened and why I left. I replied that my wife and I had a disagreement and that I could no longer live with her. After some wrangling, they left it at that. The taller one stated that he would inform the government that he had found me. I asked if they were going to inform my wife, and he said, no. They were not interested in my wife. I was sure they knew the reason for my departure. They reminded me of my non-disclosure agreements and gave me the usual implied threats. I thanked them, and they left. As I was leaving, the shorter agent turned and said, "I understand. I'm sorry." I saw the pain in his eyes. I nodded and nothing more was said. Back to work, Al had me work on the brakes. I guess Al didn't trust me after that, and I left after a week. I always assumed the feds were watching me after that, and every once in a while one of them would show up to check up on me. I guess they just wanted to make sure I wasn't divulging any secrets. I had my own problems. I hardly talked to anyone. I can't remember a single conversation I've had since I left. Talking to someone or passing on their secrets was far from easy. I was damaged. I think people saw that and left me alone. I stayed on the East Coast for about a year and then headed west. New Orleans, Houston, Kansas City, Phoenix, and then the Pacific. Worked a little bit. Did a little thinking, a lot of crying. I tried to remember anything from our past, what was said, what was missed. No one. But I couldn't. I remembered every conversation with her, every insult. What had I done wrong? Every good moment, every bad moment. I didn't notice it. I wondered how you boys were doing. I missed you. But I couldn't look you in the eye with what I now knew. By the end of the second year, the pain had subsided a little. I only cried at night. Some days 10 minutes of peace was enough for me. I began to piece together everything related to our past. Sandy had a coworker named Robert. I met him a couple times. Asshole. I never liked him, and at the time, I couldn't tell you why. I dated another coworker named Randy. Same thing. She had a close friend named Susan, and I remembered that her boyfriend's name was Michael. I remembered Susan saying he was good on the guitar. He played in a rock band somewhere. Each memory killed me more. The facts were revealed, but the reasons behind them were not. Did she do this on purpose? Why the names? I was in the pits of hell. On the West Coast, I began to find a new peace. I found that I enjoyed watching the sunset over the ocean. I would find a spot in the evening and watch the waves and the sun until dark. I watched hundreds of these sunsets. Each one was unique. Each one gave me time to think, time to remember. I felt like I was healing. Perhaps the reasons for this will never be revealed. I ended up in Seattle. I was working as a waiter at a family restaurant when things changed again. A couple guys came in. They looked like nerds, with pocket protectors and everything. They laid out a blueprint of an airplane. I threw a quick glance at it. A small executive jet. While I waited for them to order, I took a closer look at the blueprint. They placed the order, and I said, "The air intakes are wrong." "What?" I said. "If you change the air intakes, you can increase the power of the engine." "How do you know?" one of them replied. "Just a lucky guess." I took a napkin, put it on the drawing, drew the engines, and changed the air intakes. I pulled out a piece of paper and did some quick calculations. Just by doing this, you'll increase performance by about 23%. They were at a loss for words. The chassis is wrong too. I left to give water to table 5. When I brought them lunch, they didn't say a word, but they left a good tip. The next day, I waited for my tables again. It was crowded at lunchtime and I was bustling around. A guy in a suit comes in and sits down in my area. I bring him an iced tea and ask him what he would like. He pulls out a blueprint. I notice it has my reception changes added to it. "Did you make this?" he asks. "Yes." "You say the gear is wrong too." "Yes." "Can we talk?" "Are you going to order something?" "Your modification will increase productivity by 22.7%. You were very close in your calculations." "I guess I'm behind on the practice." "Can we talk?" "Not now, I'm busy." "Maybe later? It's important." "Okay, I get off work at 4. Be here then." At 4, he was waiting at the door. He introduced himself as Brad Linsky, asked about my history, and I told him I'd done a little airplane work in another life. He wanted more, but I didn't offer anything else. We discussed landing gear. Then he told me all about it. He and some partners were developing a new executive-class airplane. They had funding and firm orders when the airplane was ready. With my modifications to the landing gear, the airplane could become profitable. They wanted more of what I had to offer. I told him I needed to think about it. I didn't know if I was ready to go back to life. I thought long and hard over a week. Would my past life come up? Was it a problem? Did I have any pain left? I sat on Pike's Pier and watched the boats come and go. I admired the sunset over the sound. I decided to call him. The next day, Brad met me at the restaurant and a limo took us to the airport. An hour later, we were already seated on a Citation airplane bound for San Diego. On the plane, I looked over a few more drawings of their executive jet and made a couple more suggestions. Brad was taking lots of notes. I told Brad about my jet design history. My family life was not discussed. In San Diego, we met with a couple of attorneys, drew up a contract, and the next thing I knew, I was a partner. My ideas were incorporated into the airplane, and some were sent to the patent office for registration. A month later, we were ready to begin the serious work of finalizing the airplane. I had to move to San Diego to keep up. One day, the feds stopped by to talk to us. They were the same 2 guys that had been in Atlanta, as well as an Air Force engineer I had worked with before. They looked at what I was doing and read the confidentiality agreement. They weren't happy, but they couldn't stop me. Work was in full swing when we got a call from Airbus. They wanted to use my ideas in their next-generation passenger airplanes. Then Boeing called. We licensed the systems, and the money started coming in. Every airplane we built brought us serious royalties. A year later, I bought a house on the beach, and now I could sit and watch sunsets from my back porch every day. I realized that getting back to work, doing what I love, being in demand was what I needed to get my life back. I've been here for almost 2 years now. We've turned the company into something respectable, something of value. I buried myself in my work. I haven't had anyone in my life for the last 5 years. This monologue is the biggest thing I've said in the last 5 years. It was lonely. I looked at Robert. There was a look of sadness on his face that was uncharacteristic of his years. As I looked around, I noticed that it had already gotten dark. The sun had already set. The sports bar was very quiet, with only a few people standing around. Margot caught my gaze and quickly averted it. There were tears in her eyes as well. "So, what are we going to do next?" I asked. "I don't know." The tears flowed again. "Does your mom or brothers know you found me?" "They don't even know I was looking for you. No one knows." "What are you going to tell them?" "I don't know. I need to think about it." "There's a beautiful point a half-mile west of here that overlooks the ocean. I've spent many hours there, watching the waves and thinking." I asked him if he had a place to stay, and he said that was fine. Robert got up to leave. He looked about 10 years older than when he entered the house, hunched over, tired. His world had completely changed in just a few hours. I didn't know what to do. Should I hug my father and son? Shake hands? He answered for me by grabbing my shoulders and hugging me. I felt his tears on my neck, and mine on his. Sandy has become a blurry story that I'm constantly trying to keep private. But the boys are a different story. I know I wasn't their father, but I failed them anyway. They were and still are the real victims of this tragedy. Many nights I cried for them. I was too weak to stay and help them. I hoped they would forgive me. I don't think they ever will. "Can we talk tomorrow?" he asked. "I'll be here," replied I. And with that, he left. I sat back down in a daze. I now had my past life in front of me, and I didn't know what to do. Margot came over and sat down at the table. She brought out a couple bottles of beer and set them in front of us. She took a big sip. We sat in silence for a long time. I saw him come in, and he had trouble written all over his face. She began. "I thought we were going to have to break something up. I stayed close in case he started something. I didn't want to eavesdrop. I heard everything." She leaned over and put her arms around me and cried. "I'm sorry," she whispered. What am I going to do now? Part 2. Robert's story. "You're not my son," it echoed in my ears. I remembered every syllable, every intonation down to the smallest detail. I think I heard the rest of the story too, but that first sentence was more memorable than all the ones that followed. My whole world, my whole existence was called into question. I was not conceived in love, as I had known all my life, but in something else. But what? Tears burned my face. Staggering out of the restaurant, I walked out of the restaurant and headed back to the shelter of my hotel room. I had gotten a room at a small hotel in Pacific Beach. I tried to make sense of the day's events and couldn't. I wanted my family back, but I knew that was impossible. However, I also knew I had to move forward. I had been the father of our family for the past 5 years, and I had grown up a lot. I couldn't let my brothers down now. As I lay down that night, past conversations and events were burning my soul. My whole life flashed before my eyes. Every little league you game, every family dinner, every time he sat with me doing math homework, every time he held my head as I vomited into the toilet from the flu flashed through my mind. I couldn't recall a single bad memory of this man. Pain and sadness consumed me until Morpheus took over. Dawn shook me out of my sleep. The cold fall air of the Pacific Ocean chilled me to the core. The night gave me no guidance for the future. I grabbed my shorts, t-shirt, and boots and headed to his house. I was only a couple miles away from him, but the journey seemed longer. I showed up on his doorstep around 8 o'clock. I rang the doorbell. But no sooner had the sound died down than the door opened and he appeared on the doorstep. He invited me in. I declined. "I listened to what you said yesterday. I hope you realize that I have a lot of questions to answer and a lot of problems to solve." He looked at me with sadness in his eyes. I continued, "I'm going home today. I need to decide what to do." "What will you tell your brothers? And to your mom?" "I don't know," I answered with all sincerity. I didn't know what I would tell my brothers. Mom was a whole other story. I looked at him. This was the man who had raised me. I don't care. This man was my father. There was silence between us for a few moments. I broke it and said, "I don't know who my biological father is. Whoever he is, He's not my father. You are. You always have been, and you always will be. There was silence again, and then the tears flowed. Daddy, I said, and threw myself into his arms. We both clung tightly to each other. Can we go back into your life? I'm not sure how my brothers would feel about that. I hesitated. Yeah, I know. We all want you back. Dad said, I want back into your lives more than anything. I want to redeem myself, but I don't know how. I can't look into your mother's eyes. My pain is too deep. I'm unsure of every memory, every time we spent together, and my entire life. I can't face it. He led me into the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee. We sat at the kitchen table and watched the birds on the patio. The waves were lapping at the beach beyond the patio. I started, Dad, you've given me a lot to process. Mom hurt you. She hurt all of us, but she's still my mom. Since you've been gone, things have changed. I don't know how to make sense of it all. A couple tears rolled down his cheeks. I don't know how she could do that to you, to us. I understand everything you said yesterday, but you're my father. You're the father of my brothers and me, no matter what the tests say. You've been everything in our lives, and we have to deal with that. I don't know how this is going to end, but I know you have been and will continue to be a part of our lives. I saw the burden of the ages lifted off my father. He seemed to grow a full foot taller. He stood as big as I remembered him. He hugged me in a way that ripped the air out of my lungs. I cried and he hugged me, and I could feel his sobs as he squeezed me. Thank you, he whispered. Please forgive me. I will do everything in my power to make it up to you and your brothers. With all the strength I could remember, he held on. He pulled me against him and said, I will give everything I have to you and your brothers to make it up to you. Me too, said I. I hugged him one last time and headed to the car. The trip from Colorado to San Diego took just under 16 hours. I traveled that distance in one full day. For the trip home, I was going to split the trip into 2 days. For the night, I would stop somewhere in the vicinity of St. George, Utah. Although I did a lot of thinking on the way west, I felt that the trip home would take more of my attention. As I began the drive home, I remembered the past. I remembered how, as a young boy, I never knew what my father did for a living. He would leave in the morning and come home in the evening. Whatever my dad did, he made pretty good money. Every time we moved, we bought a new house in a decent neighborhood. As far as I knew, we weren't rich, but we didn't have to worry about money for clothes or groceries, and the bills were always paid. As a teenager, I didn't know much about money, but the lack of it was never a reason we couldn't do something. I had a small allowance for Coke, video games, and other little things that kept me happy most of the time. I even got a bonus if I needed to watch my brothers. As I got older, I overheard something about airplanes a couple of times. However, I never figured out what exactly he was doing, except that it was military-related and no one was allowed to talk about it. Every few months, someone in uniform would show up for dinner. My brothers and I whispered that Dad was a secret agent. We had fantasies that he would fly off to some exotic place and steal secrets from Russian dictators. He was our hero. Even while working as a secret agent, he still found time to play ball with me. I remembered the day he left. I was only 16. I got home from school early that day. I usually dropped my school bag at the foot of the stairs and ran to the refrigerator. My mom always yelled that I was drinking milk straight from the bag, but when no one was home, it was fine. I remember a note on the kitchen table. It said, I know. What the hell does that mean? I thought. I left it there. Mom and Dad wouldn't be home for another couple of hours, so I turned on the TV to watch an episode of The Simpsons that I had recorded. About a half hour later, I went upstairs to do my homework. Randy and Michael came home and went to play in the backyard. They didn't have as much homework as I did. Tim used to stop by his friend's house after school. He would barge into the house like a tornado around dinner time. I was sitting in my room when I heard a scream. It sounded like an animal being slaughtered. I ran downstairs and found my mom on the floor clutching a note to her chest. She was sobbing uncontrollably. I asked what was wrong, but she was crying so hard she couldn't get a word out. She seemed to be in a lot of pain. I don't think Randy and Michael heard her. They must have been deep in the backyard. I lifted Mom to her feet and carried her upstairs to her bedroom. I didn't know what to do, so I just held her while she cried. She was hugging me. I don't remember any intelligible words. After a time that seemed like an eternity, she calmed down enough to let go of me. I put her back on the bed, and all she did was whimper. She grabbed Daddy's pillow and curled up around it. I didn't know what to do, so I left the room and closed the door behind me. I went downstairs and met Randy and Michael in the kitchen. "Where's Mom?" asked Randy. "She's upstairs. I don't think she's feeling well," replied I. "What's for dinner?" Randy returned, not caring about Mom's health. "I don't know." "Let's wait for Dad. He'll know," put in Michael. We waited for about an hour. Randy and Michael pulled out the Xbox and started playing against each other. Tim came home and joined his brothers in the competition. There was yelling and screaming coming from the family room. I went back upstairs to check on Mom. She was still lying curled up on Dad's pillow. "Mom," I whispered. She seemed to be awake. "Mommy," I said a little louder. She stirred and looked up at me with crying eyes. "When is Daddy coming home to make dinner?" I asked. I watched as the tears flowed. "He had to go out of town for a while. Why don't you be the master of the house tonight and make macaroni and cheese for you and your brothers?" she asked in a quiet voice. "Sure, Mom. What about you? Are you going to come down?" "I'm not sure, sweetheart. Are you going to be okay without me?" I was sure I could manage. I made macaroni and cheese all the time. Cooking it for my brothers wouldn't be a problem. I boiled water and boiled the noodles. After 10 minutes, I called my brothers to the table. Conversations around the table centered on the latest Xbox game, who got in a fight at school, and when is the next basketball game. Only a couple of passing remarks concerned the absence of Mom and Dad. It was Randy's turn to do the dishes, and when everything was done, I quietly snuck upstairs to check on Mom. Only a small table lamp was burning, and the room was half dark. She was turned away from the door, still hugging her pillow. I don't know if she woke up or heard me. The next day, we all got up, got dressed, ate our porridge, and headed off to school. Mom wasn't around, but that wasn't unusual. When I got home, it was the same as most other days. Bag of textbooks by the stairs, refrigerator, glass of milk, then 30 minutes of TV. My brothers would come home at the usual time, and the yelling and screaming would begin. However, something was wrong. I went upstairs, peeked into my parents' room, and saw my mom on the bed. It didn't look like she had moved an inch since I had seen her last night. I crept up. "Mom, are you okay?" I said. Without moving, she replied, "Honey, can you order pizza for you and your brothers? I have some money in my purse." I walked around the bed and went to her purse. When I pulled out her purse, I looked at my mom. She looked awful. My mom was usually a very beautiful woman. Some of my friends even joked that she was beautiful, but now she looked really bad. Her eyes were sunken and red. Her hair was tangled. She was wearing the same clothes as last night. I began to get very worried. I decided I'd better call my dad. Even when he was out of town, he always called us, but most of the time it was closer to bedtime. Going downstairs, I called Dad's cell phone. He didn't answer. I left a message and waited for him to call back. He didn't call back. I started to get really worried. What's wrong? I almost immediately thought the worst. Did something bad happen to Daddy? Is that why Mom was crying? I didn't say anything to my brothers about Mom or that Dad was missing. Dad never called me back that night. When I went to bed, I had tears in my eyes too. After a restless sleep, I woke up and headed to my mom's room. When I opened the door, I saw that she was still lying in bed and whispered, "I'm fine, sweetie. Go get yourself and your brothers ready for school. We'll all have a little talk tonight." All day long, I had been dreading what this conversation would be about. I didn't seem to hear any of the teacher's lessons. All day long, I was withdrawn. At the last bell, I ran straight home. When I got home, Aunt Shannon was already there. She was cleaning downstairs and washing dishes left in the sink. We called her Aunt Shannon, but she wasn't a relative. She was a close friend of Mom's, and I think they worked together. This was another bad sign. I immediately went upstairs to my room. The door to Mom's room was closed. I sat down on my bed and started fighting back tears. Every now and then, a single tear trickled down my cheek. I heard my brothers come in, and a little while later, Xbox came in as well. I wondered if they were experiencing a sense of impending doom. How could they not know that something bad was about to happen? I could hear Aunt Shannon rattling pots and pans in the kitchen. She called Tim to set the table, and 5 minutes later she called everyone to dinner. We were all already seated at the table when Mom came downstairs. You could see that she had made some effort but still looked like death. She didn't say anything and sat down in her usual seat. Aunt Shannon started serving the food. There was no Daddy and no place set for him. Suddenly, as if we all knew something bad was happening, the talking stopped. The snide remarks from one brother to another stopped halfway through. Nothing was said about who he liked. No teasing of his brother's silly friends. No talk of an ugly haircut. Nothing. All those loving comments that bring a family together were now a thing of the past. Somehow, through mental telepathy, we all knew that nothing would ever be the same again. I watched my mom with the corner of my eye. She would take food on her plate, but I never saw her eat anything. Often she wiped her tears with a napkin. It didn't look like she was going to sit through the rest of dinner. Halfway through the meal, Mom started, "Boys!" All of our attention was on her. I saw Shannon reach out to take her hand, as if to give her strength to continue. "I have done something terrible. Your father is very hurt and angry with me. He has forsaken me. I don't know how long he will be angry or when he will return. I do know that your father loves you and wishes you no harm." She looked around the table, taking in the faces of each of us. When she caught my gaze, I saw her tears and felt my own flowing. I was afraid to look at my brothers, but sobs came to me from the end of the table. She continued, "From today, things will be different, but we will remain a family even in his absence. We will respect his decisions and never say a bad word about him. The blame lies solely on me." I saw Shannon squeeze Mom's hand. "Rep, you all have no reason to believe that you did anything to push your father into this decision. You've all been good sons, and he's proud of you." With those words, Mom got up from the table and went upstairs. No one else said another word. The food remained on the plates, and after a couple minutes, my brothers separately ran out from the table to grieve. I sat stunned. Shannon got up and started clearing away the plates. Out of habit, I got up to help. Shannon began to wash the dishes, and I took a seat next to her to wipe up. In a quiet voice, she said, "Robert, you are the oldest. A lot is going to fall on your shoulders. You must do what you can to help your brothers through it. Your brothers need you." She turned to face me. "Robert, can you do that?" I nodded slowly. "Robert, your mother will need you too. She will carry this burden and guilt for a long time to come. You must not let that guilt overwhelm her. You will have to support her at times. Hug her when she cries and remind her of your brother's love. You will have to give her your love too. Can you do that?" I nodded and wondered who would help me. The tears came again. I apologized and went upstairs to be alone. That dinner began the slow destruction of our family. Before that, I think Mom had been volunteering at the Cancer Society. The following week, Mom announced that she had found gainful employment. She sadly said, "I won't be earning much at first, so we may have to watch our expenses." From that point on, money became another concern in our family. Within 6 months, almost all of our extra money was cut. No more Xbox games, no more dinners at nice restaurants, and no more extra money for Doritos after school. My brothers felt it and complained more than I did. I took the first step to take my share. I quit sports after high school and got a part-time job. I convinced my mom to let me get my school work permit and got a job at Denny's. I cleaned tables, filled glasses with water, and transferred coffee into cups. I worked about 20 hours a week. I worked for minimum wage, but I got a cut of the waitress's tips. I split that money with my brothers and gave them each about $30 a week. This softened the blow a bit for my brothers. However, money was not the only problem. Soon, guilt began to eat away at our family, and each of my brothers manifested it in their own way. For some reason, my brothers decided that what they did was part of the reason my father left. If only I hadn't gotten that D on my math test. If only I hadn't made that mistake playing shortstop. If only I'd told him how much I loved him. They each found 100 reasons. Unfortunately, so did I. Randy plunged headlong into his studies. From that day on, he never brought home a grade lower than an A. He once confided in me that if his father ever came home, he wanted him to be proud of him. Tim did the same thing with sports. He would get to the practice field before everyone else, practice harder, and be the last to leave. He was rewarded with starting spots on the soccer, basketball, and baseball teams. By his freshman year, he was the best player in the conference in 2 sports and was on his way to being named America's best player. However, that dedication took its toll. With his looks and the fact that he was a star athlete, he didn't even have a girlfriend. He couldn't afford to waste time on that. With Michael, things were different. For the first couple years, Michael played guitar. He would lock himself in his room and play songs he heard on the radio. He played pretty well. But when he turned 13, he started to change. He started hanging out with some not-so-good kids. These kids had a reputation for getting into trouble. By the time he was 14, I'm pretty sure Michael was smoking. More than once, he came home with bloodshot eyes and staggered. I tried to talk to him, but he just brushed me off. "You don't own me," he said. "You're not my father." He yelled with anger in his eyes. I didn't know what to do. I was racked with guilt. I worked 40 hours a week. I was promoted to waiter, and I was making good money. I still shared everything with my brothers. With all of this, Mom was becoming more and more withdrawn. I saw a change in her every month. 6 months after dinner, I think she realized that Dad was never coming back. From then on, all she did was work, sometimes 60 hours a week, come home and cook dinner and retire to her room afterward. The sweet mom I once had was fading away, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. Aunt Shannon would stop by about once a month to talk to everyone, but that was the only guest we had in the house. End of part 1. Part 2 may be coming out in 10 hours. Write in the comments if you're waiting for it. Also, give a like under this video and subscribe to my channel. I hope you enjoyed this video.